is Mr. Zahid Abdullah, who is currently serving as Federal Information Commissioner at Pakistan Information Commission. He has been contributing to the right of information and disability rights movements within and outside the country as a trainer, resource person, as a researcher. In 2012, he helped establish Coalition of Right to Information, and in 2017, the Nationwide Coalition for Inclusive Pakistan. He is also an author of Disabled Society and The Wise Man, and has been contributing articles in national dailies on human rights issues. Our third speaker is Elizabeth Tydd. She is a New South Wales Information Commissioner, Open Data Advocate, and CEO for the Information and Privacy Commission. As an executive leader, Elizabeth has implemented regulatory reform across legal, public, and commercial sectors. Elizabeth has a deep understanding of integrity and governance, particularly in digital government, from a statutory and executive perspectives. Our next speaker, our last speaker, is Jaco Du Toit. He is a Chief of Universal Access to Information section at the Communication and Information sector of UNESCO. He previously held different positions in UNESCO field offices all over the world. So we may start our session now, and we are starting with Dr. Lida Ayoubi.
Hello and good morning, everyone. And for those of you joining us from the Southern Hemisphere, good evening. It is currently 11 p.m. in New Zealand, and I'm doing this webinar from our living room as my partner is already asleep in the bedroom next to my office. This also means if I make any errors, I can blame it on it being bedtime here in New Zealand. I'd like to thank the organizers of the 2022 Global Disability Summit and UNESCO for organizing this side event and for giving me and the other panelists the opportunity to be part of the discussion on access to public information for persons with disabilities. So as the program indicates, I am going to discuss the research I did last year for UNESCO on the inclusion of persons with disabilities and the rights in access to information, or ATI legislation around the world. The methodology I used for the research was to start with searching for ATI legislation in every UN member state. And then within that legislation to look for any direct or indirect references to access to information for persons with disabilities, or any other provisions that would facilitate access to public info for persons with disabilities. Now, before I get into the findings of the research, I'd just like to acknowledge that one of the limits of the project, which was due to the nature of it, was its focus on access to information legislation specifically. So what I mean by it being a limitation is that it might be the case that in a country there is no ATI legislation to begin with, or that the legislation does not specifically recognize the rights of persons with disabilities, for instance, in New Zealand. But that does not mean that there are not other policies or measures in place for provision of access to information for persons with disabilities. But it does mean that there is no clear or explicit recognition of the rights of persons with disabilities in access to information legislation, and that on its own would have certain consequences. So back to the results of the survey of access to information legislation. As of August 2021, and I don't believe much has changed since, but I stand corrected, 132 countries out of all the UN member states have enacted access to information laws. And out of those 132, only 37 explicitly refer to persons with disabilities. So once those 37 pieces of legislation were identified, I then started looking at the degree to which they conform with those countries that had the legislation that referred to persons with disabilities, whether those provisions conformed with countries' obligations towards their citizens with disabilities under international human rights law, and more specifically, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that meant looking at a number of different factors. So for today, I'm going to briefly go over the common themes that stood out when examining those 37 ATI laws. You can read more about these as well as the identified challenges to implementation of these existing ATI legislation and corresponding recommendations in the issue brief that UNESCO has recently published. But I will not discuss the implementation challenges or best practices or recommendations, as my fellow learned panelists will discuss these issues after me later. So back to the common themes. When assessing the 37 ATI legislation, the categories that were looked at and the themes that were... Pardon? Oh, sorry. So as you can see on the slide, the common themes that stood out and I kind of focused on were, so firstly, I looked at the quality, for lack of a better word, of the reference to the rights of persons with disabilities. And it means how brief or comprehensive the recognition of the rights of persons with disabilities was in the ATI legislation, and more precisely, what was the terminology used. For instance, some legislation used quite weak or broad terms as assistance or consideration, while other ATI legislation used more clear and direct language and specifically discussed the rights of persons with disabilities. The next point that was looked at was the type of disability that was covered under the ATI legislation. The results for this factor were quite mixed. Some countries did use inclusive terminology, such as disabled persons or persons with disabilities, but others had put limits on the type of disability when it comes to provision of access to information. For example, the legislation only referred to physical disability, or only mentioned persons with impaired sight, or persons short of hearing, or persons who have difficulties with speech. The other problematic issue was the use of really outdated language with regards to disability, which I prefer not to repeat here in order not to cause any offense. So once it was determined that the legislation had considered access to information for persons with disabilities, I then looked at how the access was to be provided in terms of requesting information, receiving information, and any conditions around that. So I looked at the submission of a request for access to information and whether accessible modes of submission were considered. So I found that out of the 37 countries, 11 allow applicants with disabilities to submit an oral request, where normally a written request would be appropriate or required. Sometimes the law specifically state that the information provider or the appropriate authority would convert such oral requests into written ones, again, when that would be the primary mode of submission of a request. Additionally, 6 countries require that information providers assist persons with disabilities in submitting their request, where their disability prevents them from doing that themselves in a manner that is generally prescribed by the law. Well, both of these approaches raise some concerns, as in, for instance, making of a verbal request in lieu of a written one might still not be suitable to some persons with disabilities. And it's also not clear when the legislation discusses assistance, what that actually means in terms of submission of a request for information. The other common theme related to the type of information that would be available to persons with disabilities. When looking at this factor, what was mainly considered was the distinction between online and offline information. Out of the 37 laws, only 2 specifically reference the availability of accessible online information to persons with disabilities, which is of course problematic in this day and age. And the other point is in relation to whether the information, public information, would be made available to persons with disabilities only when such access is requested, or whether countries would try to proactively provide accessible information or make it available to persons with disabilities, which is of course very significant on its own when assessing the overall fulfillment of access to information obligations of countries. The next theme was the format in which requested information is provided and whether it would be accessible to persons with disabilities or not. So say a request for information is made by a person with disabilities or on their behalf, and not all of the 37 countries that include or reference persons with disabilities actually discuss the format of the information that will be provided. And it can be argued that in those countries that they do not mention accessibility, arguably the information that's provided to a person with a disability can be the same information that's given to a non-disabled person, which could mean that the information will not be of any use to the disabled person, or that the assumption is that the burden of turning that information into an accessible format lies with the disabled person themselves. Again, assistance was mentioned in terms of receipt of information, but it wasn't clear what that assistance referred to. 11 out of the 37 countries do specifically mention the provision of information to persons with disabilities in an accessible format, which is positive. And 10 out of the 11 use broad wording that refers to an alternative format or an accessible format. But I think this can still be a bit of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, when you mention accessible format generally, it means that it could be many different things: Braille, audio, large print, so on and so forth, which could be helpful, or it could mean that the information provider gets to choose what accessible format to make the information available in, and that the specific format might not be suitable to the needs of the person with a specific disability. And then finally, with regards to proactive disclosure of information, only one country refers to content accessibility for persons with disabilities when the information requested is information on websites. So again, quite a big problem with online information. The other theme was whether the legislation places any restrictive conditions on provision of access. So again, say rights are recognized in the law, a disabled person manages to make a request, and then it comes to provision of accessible information. Out of those 11 countries that I mentioned before that refer to the provision of accessible information or information in alternative formats, 3 of them place limits on the provision of information, and they restricted, or the conditions they pose relate to cost, time constraints, or copyright law restrictions. So again, all of these can be restrictive, and it would run the risk of contributing to the requests from persons with disabilities being unreasonably declined, or it could create delays. On the contrary, a handful of laws do explicitly state that, at least with regards to cost, the cost of provision of information should not be imposed on persons with disabilities. So that's a very good positive. But again, that's only a handful of countries, and the majority of the 37 are silent on the issue of cost, or are at the other end of the spectrum where they do actually impose quite broad, essentially broad limits. And finally, I looked at clarity in the legislation around appeal and oversight mechanisms. And again, unfortunately, out of the 37 countries, only one country refers to sanctions and fines, to be exact, for the failure to provide access to information for persons with disabilities. Some of the other legislation in the 37 have general appeal and oversight measures that is not limited to persons with disabilities, but generally relate to the appropriate authorities' obligation to provide access to public information, and it could be argued that persons with disabilities could rely on those mechanisms. But again, that would need to be separately assessed, how effective those measures are for guaranteeing the rights of persons with disabilities specifically. So those were the main themes or issues that really stand out when assessing whether access to information legislation are in line with the rights of persons with disabilities to access public information. One other issue to consider is, of course, the intersectionality issue, meaning among persons with disabilities themselves, some may face extra challenges that exacerbate the difficulty of access to public information. For example, this could be due to language barriers in countries where there are multiple ethnicities and linguistic differences. Persons with disabilities living in poverty, where there is lack of education, where there could be gender, sexual orientation, or age-based discrimination. And these additional challenges and their role in worsening the impact of disability on access to information should really be considered and be part of the discussion on improving the legislative framework that ensures access to information for persons with disabilities. So that is all from me. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, and Lida, and really for this comprehensive presentation of the survey. Just putting it in the context, I want to say that UNESCO is a custodian agency of the global for the global monitoring of SDG indicator 16.2, which is actually an indicator urging member states to adopt and introduce legal frameworks for access to information. What we are doing here with this survey and with the UNESCO questionnaire, which is the provider of the so much the data for the presentation we've just heard, is we want to put a special focus, special emphasis on people with disabilities in the context of access to information laws. So this is one of the new UNESCO initiatives, relatively new, of course, because UNESCO was very much active in the field of advocacy for access to information for persons with disabilities for a very long time. Now, just one quick remark before going to our next speaker. We have a Q&A feature on the Zoom, so everybody from the audience who wants to ask questions, please post your questions in the Q&A, and in the end of the event we'll have 10 minutes to respond to some of them. And now I'm handing over floor to Zahid Abdullah, and I understand that Zahid will be addressing the practical issues of the law and its implementation. Zahid, please unmute your microphone, and the floor is yours. Zahid, you have to unmute your microphone. We are having some technical problem here, Mr.
Yes, okay.
Oh,
Yes, sir.
here we are.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Sorry for this inconvenience. And I will be raising some questions here with regard to information accessibility, and then I will be contributing my 2 cents to ensure access to information to persons with disabilities. So first of all, when we see the lack of information accessibility for persons with disabilities, which is my experience here, I see it in terms of structural discrimination. It is a kind of otherization of persons with disabilities, in sharp contrast to the inclusion of persons with disabilities, and it is reflected in the institutional responses, but in the shape of different structures, be it public bodies, commissions, or even legislation. Although my earlier colleague, as he reflected, there has been some developments, but we need to go a long way to ensure access to information in accordance with the different needs of persons with different disabilities. So, why this otherization? And when I say this otherization of persons with disabilities, we can see it even on the demand side of effective right to information legislation, and also on the implementation side of these RTI laws. For example, it is a wonderful initiative. I'm so glad that UNESCO now has taken up this information accessibility issue, and it has done this very serious work. And it also, UNESCO took the initiative to be part of this disability summit, so that these issues could be talked about. And going into the future, this is where I think we in collaboration, we mean civil society, global civil society, how it complements the good work being done by UNESCO. In this connection, I feel there is a dichotomy between the demand for open government when civil society organizations in different countries, and also those organizations that are working at the international level, when they demand for open government, open for whom? And that is a very important question. If we want open government, it is meaningless for us persons with disabilities. If it is open, for us, open would only be meaningful when it is open and accessible. So when we demand governments to be open, we want governments and public bodies to be open and accessible with regards to the information accessibility. So in this regard, what disability persons with disability need is, what they need is the non-disabled RTI champions and experts to take up their cause. Because if the non-disabled experts working in the area of right to information, when they measure the effectiveness of right to information laws, and I know my very good friend Toby Mendel has developed this very excellent rating methodology, and it measures the reactive side of access to information. But maybe, and it is just a suggestion, that either this rating methodology that has been developed by Center for Law and Democracy, it should also include rating for the assessment of proactive disclosure of information clause within the RTI laws, because we need to determine whether the way information is proactively disclosed through websites as a legally binding requirement under these RTI laws, is it accessible? Do these proactive disclosure clauses make it binding on the governments and public bodies to ensure that information is accessible for all? Now, as an information commissioner here, ensuring implementation of the Right of Access to Information Act 2017 in Pakistan, when I looked at the clause section 5, it says that the information will be made accessible through websites. So in my different detailed judgments, around 40 of them, I have interpreted the word accessible in terms of that information should be made accessible through websites for all people, including those with different disabilities. So I had to stretch kind of an progressive interpretation of the this clause, and also by juxtaposing it with the other disability law that we have in Pakistan, which it's section 15 subsection 5 says that government will ensure that service providers will ensure accessibility of websites. So in that sense, but I think it is time, because if RTI laws ratings or their implementation level sees only in terms of how laws are helping in terms of improving transparency and openness, they by default leave out 10 to 15% of the people with different disabilities throughout the world out of the equation. So, so maybe civil society at the global level should join hand with UNESCO, the way they have developed this methodology to put this information accessibility agenda forward. And I also believe, other than that, these persons who are not disabled but are experts or activists on right to information and transparency. Of course, persons with disabilities have to talk about their rights, and they have been talking about their rights. But you know, if you see, this otherization is also reflected if we look at the need as to why UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities has been signed and ratified by so many countries and is now an international instrument. And the need was felt that existing international instruments or efforts needed to be complemented to ensure accessibility in different areas, including right to information. They needed to be talked about in greater detail through UN Convention on Rights of Disabilities, because there was clearly a need that their needs of persons with disabilities wasn't being adequately reflected in the earlier efforts or earlier instruments. So that is why UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities came into being. And the other thing is that when as a person who is working in the area of right to information, or when disabled people stand up for their rights, that is absolutely fine, and they should do and keep on doing it. But once it is left only to the persons with disabilities to take up their causes, I see there is this dichotomy between the demands raised by non-disabled people in terms of raising demands for transparency and openness, and the needs of persons with disabilities with regard to access to information. This dichotomy, it has been addressed through this excellent initiative of UNESCO, but it should also be reflected in the way demand for open, transparent, and accessible governments is made. because it is not onus on the persons with disabilities, because they are with these different needs, that they should be raising demands. It should be a kind of a holistic approach, because it puts persons with disabilities in a very sometimes awkward situation, as if they need to validate, they need to explain their different disabilities. And the other thing is that persons with disability, when the non-disabled people, it is their issue as well, because somebody somewhere foots the bill. If a society is not accessible in any way, whether it comes to exercising any of the rights, whether it is right to education, right to healthcare services, and in our case, right to information with regards to special needs of people. And in this connection, I also believe that in the regulatory bodies, like for example, in this particular case, in Pakistan, that I come up with two regulatory bodies. One, this Information Commission itself, that it should, when deciding cases, and we have at least in 50 orders, we not only ask them to provide information proactively through websites in an accessible manner, but we also developed, though with limited resources, and both in terms of human and technical, a checklist with regard to ensuring a web accessibility for persons with disability in accordance with World Web Content Accessibility W3C guidelines. So commissions everywhere they also play a very active role, and through progressive interpretation of the existing laws, also recommending the governments to make explicit changes or amendments. And then in Pakistan now, people have also started questioning, for example, in Pakistan, there is this Pakistan Telecom Authority, and it has been given, it is interested in with the responsibility to ensure flow of information through websites. So they have asked them why websites are not accessible, and what are steps being taken by them. Also, I think for persons with disabilities, they should engage with their respective information commissions, and also the right to disability rights activists, whether they are speech and hearing impaired, if they have special needs with regard to, and they have very specific needs with regard to information accessibility. If they engage with the private businesses, or in my case, blind people, there is generally positive response because of the competition. They, for example, in one here in Pakistan, there was this a leading national daily. They were not, their website wasn't accessible to needs of persons with disabilities, especially the blind people. And I asked them that, you are not, your websites is not helpful because it is not according to the guidelines of W3C. So they made it accessible, and we followed them on Twitter, highlighted. First of all, we took them to task for not being accessible. Then we praised them when they were. So it kind of generated debate, and other people got involved. So there are multiple ways the way information accessibility with regards to needs of persons with disabilities can be ensured. Just summing up what I meant, that that there is this otherization, that there is this dichotomy between how the information accessibility is seen by persons who are not disabled and persons who are disabled. Persons who are not disabled, my experience is that they generally want governments to be open and transparent, but open and transparency, while it is good for persons with disabilities as well, but it would be more meaningful for them. It would, if it is accessible, if the governments are open, transparent, and accessible as well, especially with regards to whether it is their government building structures or whatever, also in terms of information. So this dichotomy needs to be ended. Person like this present initiative, I believe disability rights activists, wherever they work, at global level or local or regional level, their own demand for open and transparent governments and effective right to information laws should ensure looking into the accessibility needs of persons with disabilities. These were my 2 cents. I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Zahid, and for your extensive presentation and examples of how we can make it better. Now we'll move to our next topic, law and technology, focusing on the additional measures specific to people with disabilities. And I will ask Elizabeth to take the floor.
Thank you, Marius, and just starting my video, which is not allowing me to start at the moment. So you probably can hear my voice, but starting video is not available to me at the moment. So hopefully the voice will be enough and I'll keep trying throughout. But now I think it's actually worked, so that's wonderful. Thank you very much, Marius, for instigating this event and for UNESCO for the hosting. It's a great privilege to speak after the authority that Ms. Ayoubi and particularly Commissioner Abdullah have provided in relation to direct experience. My presentation will go more towards practical applications and explore that issue that Commissioner Abdullah has raised about what does access look like in a digital environment and for all. We need to remember that the right to information does not discriminate. It's a universal right, and our role is to actually uphold and actively promote that right. So if I could turn now to the slide presentation, I have a number of slides presented, and some of them I'll whip through, and then I'll turn to some case law that raises or crystallizes these issues very, very effectively. So if I could turn to the next slide, I'm not sure I'm in control of the screen, but if wonderful. Picking up on Commissioner Abdullah's comments and also on the comments that Linda made around what makes good access to information law. Well, the proactive release of information so that everyone can enjoy the benefit of accountability, or of the transparency of government functions and hold government to account, giving members of the public a legally enforceable right and not discriminating against that right so that all people are treated equally, and ensuring that government information is restricted only when there's an overriding public interest against the release of information. So in New South Wales, we have a second tranche piece of legislation, which certainly, I think all academics agree, outstrips the legislation that is present in a number of other jurisdictions. Queensland has this type of proactive release legislation, and so does New South Wales. The Commonwealth certainly is a tranche 1 approach to access to information. So it's a privilege to work in an environment where we're progressive in this regard and have wide jurisdiction. If I turn to the next slide now, I can take you to what I think are the 3 immutable features of contemporary government. Governments around the world are looking at digital government and the application of data. So that's an immutable feature. So to increasing partnerships and outsourcing arrangements. So traditional services that were provided by government are now being provided by third parties under contract. So what happens to the right to access information when government unilaterally decides to provide that service through another mechanism? In New South Wales, there is still a right to access information, but it's actually limited. It's limited to services and not to decision making. And how are we using AI? How are we using technology now? We are using it to inform our decision making. So I see the legislation being stretched here, and I'll give you a couple of case examples. There's also novel models of government that are increasingly transcending the traditional sectors. So state government will work with local government, or state government might be working with universities. So who holds the information and how is it accessed? And they're the three questions that absolutely must arise. And I want to probably make a public confession here. In providing information to citizens in New South Wales, I cascaded these questions. Who holds the information? Is it a contractor? Is it a private entity, or is it government? How is access provided? Will it be an algorithm, or will it be by way of a digital or a data set provided on an Excel spreadsheet, for example, or will it be a document? And then my third question was, in what form can access be provided? My learning and my confession is that I'm now thinking that question 3 needs to be question 1. In what form can access be provided? And you'll see the cases that I'm going to refer to now as we move through really highlight that reversal of order there. If I turn to the next slide, I want to just give you a brief overview of some research that we undertook in New South Wales and that we've undertaken nationally. We, every 2 years, will undertake a community attitude survey looking at various questions and analysing responses. The questions that we are keeping as constants are: how important is information to the community? Now, 72% of people agree that de-identified information should be used to inform government policy and service delivery. So there's a real acceptance by the public. 78% support the public reporting of machine learning by agencies. Tell us how you are making your decisions. Tell us how service delivery is informed by these machine learnings, because if you don't tell us, we will think it's a person. And then 81%, an astounding 81%, agree that agencies must report on the information that they hold. And if they don't report proactively, how does a citizen know where to go and how to ask for this sort of information? So if I go to the next slide, this is where I wanted to spend more of my time and follow up to hopefully inspire some questions and some other discussions. I'm going to very briefly run through each of the top 3 cases here. O'Brien and the Department of Communities and Justice. Ms. O'Brien, this is an undetermined matter yet. Its decision we're waiting with bated breath. Ms. O'Brien is a social housing tenant. She has a third-party social housing provider who derives its rental subsidy from the Department of Communities and Justice. In enticing more social housing landlords to enter the market, a few options were undertaken by the department. One included the development of an algorithm to calculate the rental subsidy that tenants would receive, and therefore the rental rates and returns in these social housing environments. So a tiny contract was entered into for a piece of software that cost about $30,000. Ms. O'Brien says, I want to challenge the rental rebate because I don't think it's been fairly applied. And as you know, the right to access information is actually an enabling right. It enables one to assert other rights, and Ms. O'Brien wants to do so. The social housing landlord also would like to understand how that software works, because they are concerned about liability and they're concerned about many other tenants. The Department of Communities and Justice would also like to know what's in that algorithm, how it works. Give us the information, because they too have a liability and they too are concerned that machine learning may have over time adjusted differently. There may be other parameters and it may not be operating according to the test suite that they provided in the first instance. So every one of the 3 of the 4 parties want access to information. The software company says, no, I will not give you my intellectual property. I'm taking you back, Lida, to your earlier comments. And if I don't win, if I don't succeed in this argument on an intellectual property grounds, I will win on the grounds under GIPA, which is the legislation I just referred to. And those grounds say that it has to be a service. I'm the software provider and I'm not providing a service. I'm providing something that informs your decision making. So that is one of the best cases that I'm aware of that really highlight the need to ensure that we have access to information, particularly for people who may be disabled and insured and receiving housing through these rental subsidy arrangements. The next case I'm going to speak to quite briefly. It involves those cross-sectorial arrangements that I spoke about. There are portals that store information now that have been developed largely in response to the combustible cladding issues that we saw in the UK and that have been identified globally. These portals share information from various government departments, including local governments, and they ensure that there is an up-to-date list of buildings that might be impacted by this combustible cladding. Citizens are asking for that information. And depending upon which entity they ask, either the local council or the Department of Planning and Industry, they might get a different answer. I don't take issue at all with the answers that have been provided, but I do take issue with the fact that that information has been found not to be held by a local council because it's held in a portal that they only access a certain amount of information from. So it's a federated model of access, which only enables certain agencies to access certain pieces of information. Can you imagine the challenge that that will present to someone who might be living in one of these apartments who may not have been notified that their building is subject to combustible cladding, and they may be disabled themselves or indeed be living with other disabled people, including their children or elderly. So the balancing of their rights is not properly ventilated unless they can have a voice, unless they can be heard in this environment, because the information has not been released on the grounds that, and again, as I've said, I don't take issue with these grounds, that they become a security risk and may become a terrorist target. So these are acute examples of having to balance the needs. The third case is the case of Redfern Legal Centre and the Commissioner of Police. This matter has been decided. And in that matter, Redfern Legal Centre sought access to the number of strip searches that were undertaken at music festivals that resulted in charges of illicit drug possession. 2 years earlier, a journalist had asked for the same information and was provided with that. 2 years later, Redfern Legal Centre was not provided with that information on the basis that the work that was required to translate information held in different data sets, and you can see I was very explicit about saying there were different data sets involved in: 1, the number of strip searches; 2, the charges that might flow or had flown. So to bring those together, the police argued that it was a substantial and unreasonable diversion of resources because an SQL code needed to be applied on top of these data sets to produce the report. And doing that might take a couple of days. And under the GIPA Act, yes, if there is a substantial and unreasonable diversion of resources, that may be a legitimate reason for not providing access to that information. Now, the police were successful in this matter, but it highlights the question that we're all dealing with, which is government holds information in silos now. It will always require some kind of treatment for it to be taken from the binary zeros and ones into a form that is accessible to people. And if that treatment is found to be a substantial and unreasonable diversion of resources, access may not be provided. Yet, that's how government treats all of its information to inform itself. So back to your dichotomy that you spoke about, Commissioner Abdullah, I think there's a growing asymmetry between the information government shares and uses for its purposes of serving citizens and the information that will be accessible to citizens. I'm going to be very quick now because I'm conscious of time. There is a digital restart fund. It's a $2 billion fund. It's been established in New South Wales, and one of the requirements of the Act that establishes that fund is to, for the responsible minister to have information from the Information Commissioner and the Privacy Commissioner about the impact of these digital services. Some of the more interesting ones we've seen are offender digital services, which enable offenders to undertake rehabilitation, potentially from iPads embedded into the walls of their custodial arrangements. And those work against criteria including responsiveness of voice, etc., and use AI to see how successful the engagement with these rehabilitative services are. The final one that I want to mention is the Digital Restart Fund, the Digital Access Program. And what that program is recommending is ambassadors to understand, to take the learnings from people who experience any form of disability and look at how technology ensures that they are better served, that they are not further alienated. And one of the interesting learnings to date has been things like chatbots that can not only present themselves in a form of written form, but also in a spoken engagement. So they're really interesting and very pleasing developments. If I could just have the next slide, please. We're also saying in relation to the procurement contracts, because governments aren't specialists in information technology, they are generally specialists in providing services. But when we engage with technology services, the intellectual property, the commercial and contract provisions actually alienate the right to access information. And so we're making recommendations on what those contracts should contain. And I've just listed some of them there. They're very important that that government maintains an ability to request audits of the system, that the vendor will update them in relation to any adverse event, any significant event, be it, you know, a number of complaints or actually legal action. And there is a requirement to ensure that that information is accessible and held securely, but also that the system operates within its stated requirements, as opposed to a deep neural learning that might actually start to input its own information and take it away from the original parameters. So they're the sorts of recommendations we're making. If I could turn to the next slide. And we're also recommending digital government must include legal by design. Maintain those rights for everyone that are enshrined. Think about ethical assessments as well. Look at the risk of the context. Is it in terms of insurance? Is it housing? Is it social media? Or is it a justice system? Ensure that there's a diversity assessment and a co-design of the types of solutions that will enable those with disabilities to ensure that that their access rights are maintained, and an ongoing notification of adverse impacts. If I turn to the next slide, I can give you an example of the types of things we're doing in the IPC to ensure that we are setting a standard, as every regulator should, as to how other government agencies should be treating this very important issue. And the final slide is one where I wanted to give you a taste of that. If we could turn to the final slide, which has in it a new, I'm just missing the final slide, and that's fine, I can speak to it anyway. The final slide is actually giving you some examples of how information commissioners in Australia worked together to develop an animation that is more accessible to everyone about the access pathways under various legislation and to promote the proactive release of information. So too, the IPC, my organisation, developed an animation that is available, readily available, and ensures that we reach people on a number of levels. And we explained the 4 access pathways under the GIPA Act, the ones that I articulated when we first commenced, particularly those about the proactive release of information. So those slides are available after the meeting, and I'm certainly able to take any questions on that or follow up at a later stage. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Marius.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We're running a little bit out of time, but we'll try to take an extra 10 minutes for Q&A because there are quite a bit of questions. Otherwise, we'll try to respond to them after the meeting. And now I'm turning to my colleague, Jaco Du Toit. He is the chief of the section of Universal Access to Information here at UNESCO, and he'll provide an overview of how UNESCO sees this issue and what are the entry points for our agency in trying to assist persons with disabilities with access to information related issues. Jaco, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marius, and thank you so much to all the speakers. I will be using some slides that would show you to which extent the work that we are doing is really centered around SDG 16, and more specifically 16.10.2 that Marius also mentioned, where UNESCO is the custodian agency on the indicator on access to information. So it is important that, of course, we do not see this in isolation, but also in relation to other SDGs, and our focus is very much on also SDG 10 and SDG 9, but we can also add gender equality, education, and other elements. But this is really the focus where we look at the question on access to information and digital inclusion. In the next slide, I think we will be able to see that it is important to take a rights-based approach. And I think this was mentioned by several of the speakers that mentioned, and here we quote Nelson Mandela, where he said that this is a basic human right and that should be forthcoming in all our democratic institutions. So the context that we are looking at in the next slide is, of course, the fact that the lack of access to information and digital divides undermine the full enjoyment of human rights, as per the quote of Nelson Mandela, that digital divides reflects and amplify existing other inequalities that we have currently in our society, and that prompt action is necessary in order to address these layers of barriers, and that it becomes part of the Sustainable Development Agenda. We'll go to the next slide, where UNESCO's work is put forward in terms of support for inclusive policy. And I think the study that we are discussing actually today is one of those examples. But we are also advocating for this rights-based openness and accessible. The Commissioner mentioned the importance of accessible involvement, accessible information when we talk about digital inclusion. And I think the last speaker also highlighted the importance of a multi-stakeholder and inclusion of people with disabilities in the discourse when we try to address these issues. In the next slide, I will just give an example of one of the projects that we're currently working on that's funded by the Nippon Foundation, where we look at measures that are necessary to make people living with disabilities fully part of the daily life. The Stories for Development project provide case studies and data on what factors actually make people with disabilities be fully part of our society, and those that excelled in this way, what are the elements that played an important role. Of course, assistive technologies and legislative frameworks are part of those factors, and we hope that more and more people can contribute to this initiative, where we could closely look at the importance of those factors that make people with disabilities excel also in the daily life as per the UN Convention. Another example that I also quickly want to add, if we can go to the next slide, is just a UNESCO prize that is funded by the state of Kuwait on digital empowerment of persons with disabilities, where we look specifically at some important initiatives, either at individual or institutional level, that make use of assistive technologies to empower people with disabilities to have access to information. This helps us in formulating policies and build more partnerships. And I see in this chat, there are already interesting initiatives that are being put forward, but also looking at the application of digital solutions to create enabling environments, and more information can be found on our website. I'll stop there, and we are looking forward to the different questions that have been posed in the chat, and for our other speakers to provide some details on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaco, and I'll go straight to the questions. We had quite a bit of them. We've selected few, and I'd ask our speakers to be brief with their answers because we are running a little bit out of time. We still have about 10 minutes. So the first question goes to Lydia, and it comes from Matthew Adeo, who is from Nigeria. And he is asking the following question. Nigeria is an environment where access to information is difficult because of the high level of bureaucracy. As an advocacy organization, what process can be taken to ensure that decision makers make the access very easy for persons with disabilities? You have this global view in your survey, Lydia. So I guess it's not only about Nigeria, but also about the good examples from the other parts of the world, which could be useful for Nigeria also. Please, Lydia.
Thank you for the question. Great question. And I think it's safe to say that bureaucracy is a problem in many parts of the world, not just Nigeria. And just very briefly, I think it's worth mentioning that I'm sure you're aware, the Freedom of Information Act in Nigeria allows third parties to lodge access to information requests on behalf of persons with disabilities. So perhaps one of the sort of quickest ways, as we all know that, changing laws and changing how governments do things could take quite a while. So one of the things that NGOs and advocacy groups could do is providing either training on maneuvering the bureaucracy for persons with disabilities, or actually running programs where information requests are made on behalf of persons with disabilities. So it could be both. So it could be an approach where awareness raising is done for persons with disabilities, but assistance is also provided in actually seeking information. I know, and we have quite a few people, or a couple of people, I think, from India who could correct me if I'm wrong or provide more information. That I know that information or access to public information clinics in India in quite a few places were very successfully run and did make a big difference in the community and how access was provided, not just to persons with disabilities, but including them. And in terms of lobbying for better access, I guess focusing on measures such as the other panelists have mentioned, accessible modes of communication, training for sign language interpreters, and of course, assistive technology that allows for that communication, providing accessible guides, just even before. I think there should be a focus on accessibility even before a request is made, whether the process itself is accessible in terms of persons with disabilities receiving information on the rights they have and things that can be done and how to go about doing that, just to give a very brief answer. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Lida. Now we have two questions which are addressed to our commissioners. The first one comes from Saad McNasty, and he's working on a ATI in MENA region. And he's asking, could commissioners describe any recent developments that they know about the improvement of the services for people with disabilities, the services provided by the commissions, and especially is the request supported by groups or NGOs, so in connection with the stakeholders, I guess. And another question which relates to that, the question on technologies, is coming from Dido Manolov, who is a UNICEF Young Champion for Social and Behavior Challenge. And Dido is asking what we can do better so that new technologies like Web3, NFT, the blockchain are accessible and not a myth and not inaccessible for a lot of young people with disabilities. So I guess, I don't know who will start. Maybe Elizabeth, you can start first, and then we'll turn to our other.
Sure. Thank you very much, Marius, and Commissioner Abdullah. Please don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'm going to be very brief. I think we have in our pockets a huge range of technologies, and we need to co-design with people who have disabilities to look at which platforms, which services, which mediums are the most appropriate. So in the IPC, as I said very briefly, we've started to try and look at all sorts of approaches and then monitoring by way of a feedback loop. Did that work? Did that assist someone? The notion of being able to apply orally when we are taking phone calls and leaving messages that translate to text messages and that are available to someone sitting at their desk, be it at home or in an office, tells us that technology can be applied to ensure accessibility by all. So I'll leave it at that, Marius.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And now I give a floor to Zahid Abdullah. Hello. We might have lost our speaker from Pakistan, but in any way, the question was answered by Elizabeth Tydd. And now what I want to conclude our meeting. We are just on time, thanking everybody for participating. We have a lot of questions and discussions and contacts being made through Q&A and chat box. So I hope that we'll have a chance to follow up on all of them. And I thank you, all of you again. Thank you very much for participating in UNESCO's webinar, and good luck with your initiatives. Goodbye.